By default. I went to see a vacations guidance counsellor, and I was accepted into psychology, medicine and law. He said, medicine won't suit you, you don't have the temperament. He said, psychology, you'd have to get a PhD and probably become a professor. And then law was by default. Psychology was my primary interest, but I was always argumentative right through school, so the non-lawyers would say it was appropriate. So as you can see, I followed his advice. I'm a professor. I enjoyed it, partly because I had teachers that were stimulating. I didn't like the politics of the environment I was in the sense that it was a police state, but that in a way was really good preparation. My original law training was in South Africa, so effectively I was in an environment where there were serious breaches of the rule of law, and that bothered me from an early stage of my career. Particularly because some of my teachers were similarly conscious, the issues around constitutional rights, basic freedoms, segregation, apartheid became very much part of what I did. And before I left South Africa, I taught constitutional law and administrative law, both of which were central, particularly at a time where there was martial law in the Cape, which got me into some difficulties because I was asked in a public setting as a teacher whether I thought this was a violation of the rule of law, the martial law declaration. And of course, that was an answer that I had to give honestly, but had ramifications. I think that the change in South Africa was totally stunning for everybody. I left the country and only went back once in effectively 19 years to visit my aging parents. And I could not accept when the Canadians sent me in before Mandela was released as a consultant to the Law Reform Commission and the ANC, I couldn't accept in my mind that this handover had been peaceful and celebrated given the previously warring factions. So for me it was a very uplifting experience looking at it from an outsider's perspective. The reality is since 1993, South Africa still has systemic problems. I worked on the Bill of Rights, and the systemic problems are, despite the constitutional protections, the disparity between rich and poor is still the highest in the world, and there's still the economic destitution, massive unemployment, and there's still a very strong racial bias in governance in the corporate sector, and I think in public and private life generally. It's a little disappointing in one respect, is we actually had a chapter, I believe it was chapter 11, which essentially was an Africanist part of the charter, which talked about governments being able to expropriate for the benefit of the public good. I came back regularly after my mandate was over, which was for 2 years, largely because the Canadians didn't want to send somebody in once the government of the ANC was legitimate. But what happened that was disturbing is that chapter was dropped out of the Bill of Rights, largely as an accommodation to large commercial interests, Anglo-American, De Beers and other large corporate organizations who in effect hinted at dislocation from South Africa if in fact these issues of social benefits detracted from their commercial interests. And in addition to that, they saw themselves being able to give charity. So they gave sums of money for education, which the government desperately needed, particularly in public schools. So there was a sort of quid pro quo, but it created, unfortunately, a delay that continues sequentially to this day in the dismantling of apartheid, which I think is still very much, unfortunately, part of South Africa. I think in fairness, and again, I don't know if money changed hands or anything like that, but in fairness, I think the ANC was desperate to fund public education. The government that was handed to them, the finances were not great. They really needed the resourcing, and I think the ANC probably was initially quite sincere about it, but perhaps not long-sighted, and probably took or received too little for giving away what was effectively a treasure, and that is the right to a voice, but also the right to engage and be part of a new world, South Africa, which was free and equal, not just in law, but also in reality. For me, really two things. One is I love teaching. There's nothing better for me than engaging with students in a classroom. I find them very bright. And leaving a classroom feeling that I've given but also received something. And the something very often is some erudite comments, which carries through to my scholarship, but also the fact that I've engaged at a sort of human level, and I like to personalize my classes as best I can. That's important. The other is the research. I mean, my view always from when I began was that Centre came every month to my account and deposited a relatively small amount, but deposited something for me to do something that I enjoyed, and my work became my hobby as well. So writing was relaxing. There were bad spots, the seventh draft and the eighth draft that shouldn't have been, and areas of difficulty. Of course, getting things published at different stages of your career always involve challenges, and the compromise with what you wanted to say and the things you could say, particularly if you were trying to, in some senses, market an idea. But those were very small compared to the relaxation of the scholarship, the one-on-one between you and the idea and the book, and the engagement with students, which I've enjoyed right through my career. I haven't actually carefully followed citations and such to my work, partly because when it's done, it's no longer mine, it belongs in some public domain, whereas early in my career I might have been more sensitive about comments that people might make. That's less so. Some of my work has been picked up and very significant in terms of what I've been told for the ARC purposes about how frequently the works are cited. But I think for me, the issue is what is the current project? I have a ARC project which is completing on international investment, which is fascinating post-Trump. Australia isolated from the US, subject to constraints on trade. That's directly, and trade and investment, that's directly in the area of research. So it's an invigoration of what was perhaps a rather mild discussion of Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, regional developments in trade. We've now got some really exciting notions at work. And those have led to other publications in the Cambridge Law Journal on the issues of good faith in contracting, on a variety of works on public policy, which are coming out in different journals, public policy in international trade and investment, and particularly dispute resolution, which is an area of particular interest. And I've always had a side involvement in international arbitration. I'm also a NAFTA panelist, have been since the NAFTA was created, and have sat on quite a number of cases, and I'm currently being asked to serve on the, I think, non-existent steel panel between Canada and the United States, which probably won't materialize under the present circumstances. I think the real problem, as the Americans and Canadians realize, there aren't jobs available for all these students, not just in law, but also in law, in areas where law graduates go. Americans have significantly reduced their student enrollments in order to stay competitive and keep attracting the top students. My view is we are growing more than we should, and there aren't jobs for them. I think the best advice I could give, particularly to the students that aren't distinctions, because most of them are not, is you need to be practical and realistic, and going forward, things such as having a good CV, having strong letters of support, having a positive attitude, which I think is very important, are key, but also to be realistic about the prospects of securing a job. And at the same time, take advice. There are people there that can provide it. We have it in the university and outside. And don't be hypersensitive if the answer is no. Even under the good times, the chances were that you would apply for a number of jobs and you'd be lucky to get an interview for a few. That's become tougher. But to take the opportunities where they occur, possibly be willing to relocate, change your horizons at a practical level. If something comes your way, great. Post-mortem constructively, the interviews you have to see how you could do better. Do public interviews privately with people that you trust and whose judgment you appreciate. Have your CV reviewed. There are lots of people that can review it. Have your letters of introduction reviewed. If you have preparations for submission, let somebody read that letter. But also, if you're asking for references, a lot of references today are verbal, give bullet points or other information to your references so they can at least be on topic and focus on the issues that are likely to be raised in the interview. I've had my own family tragedies. My view would be that I might have possibly been more commercial, in the sense that I have always valued being a professor, which my father could never fully understand, because I could do far better in a commercial setting. It's never been a serious bother to me, but I'd like to have more to give to my children than I would otherwise have had. And in that sense, maybe arbitrating more actively and charging a more meaningful fee. NAFTA work, which is fun, is not particularly financially rewarding, perhaps a little bit more opportunistic, but by the same token, I still think what I have done is more enjoyable. But I can only give you a good answer when I'm standing at the pearly gates, if I ever get there, if there is a place to go through to, where I could say what I've done has been worthwhile on balance, with, as everyone has, setbacks and slower steps forward.